At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the citizens of the Japanese city of Hiroshima looked up to see three bright silver B-29 Superfortress bombers droning overhead. This was nothing unusual. For the past year, the U.S. 20th Air Force had conducted round-the-clock firebombing raids of the Japanese home islands, reducing large swaths of Tokyo and other cities to ashes. But as the people of Hiroshima watched, one of the aircraft released not a string of tiny incendiaries, but a single, very large bomb. 20 seconds later, a blinding flash brighter than the midday sun filled the air. A searing fireball enveloped the downtown core, vaporizing its inhabitants instantly, while all around the city buildings spontaneously burst into flames. Within hours, 13 square kilometers of the city lay in ruins, and 129,000 of its 348,000 citizens were dead or wounded. And over this devastation rose a roiling, radioactive mushroom cloud. The age of atomic warfare had begun. The story of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the man who carried it out, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, is well known and has been told and retold in countless books, articles, and documentaries. Yet often overlooked, or at least covered to a much less degree outside of mentioning the name of the city, is the story of the second atomic bomb dropped on the city of Nagasaki just 3 days later. Despite this, in many ways, the second mission was even more important than the first, often credited with convincing the Japanese to surrender and end the war. It was also far more dramatic, plagued with endless bad luck and hair-raising close calls. This is the forgotten story of Charles W. Sweeney and Boxcar, the man and machine that dropped the second and so far last atomic bomb in the history of warfare. Charles William Sweeney was born on December 27, 1919 in Lowell, Massachusetts. The son of a plumber, he graduated from North Quincy High School in 1937, after which he attended evening classes at Boston University and Purdue. On April 28, 1941, Sweeney joined the U.S. Army Air Corps as an aviation cadet, receiving his commission as lieutenant in December of that year, just after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Assigned as a flight instructor and test pilot, Sweeney spent 2 years at Jefferson Proving Grounds, Indiana, before being sent to Eglin Field, Florida. In 1944, he was promoted to the rank of major and reassigned once more to Grand Island, Nebraska. Here, Sweeney was tasked with teaching pilots how to fly the brand new Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a truly massive and powerful aircraft with fuselage 30 meters long, a wingspan of 43 meters, 4 1,600 kilowatt engines, and the latest in pressurization, navigation, bomb aiming, and aerial defense technology. It was thanks to Sweeney's extensive experience with the B-29 that later that same year he was invited to Wendover Field, Utah to participate in a mysterious project called Silver Plate. An offshoot of the top-secret Manhattan Project, which had developed the first atomic bombs, the purpose of Silver Plate was to develop a practical means of deploying these brand-new weapons in combat and train aircrew to carry out atomic bombing missions. Towards this end, 17 B-29s were expensively modified, having their bomb bays enlarged and fitted with special winching, suspension, and release mechanisms to accommodate the heavy and bulky atomic bombs. To reduce weight and increase their range, the aircraft was also stripped of all their armor and defensive armament except for 2 50 caliber machine guns in the tail. To the surprise of many Silver Plate pilots, these modifications made the B-29 incredibly maneuverable, allowing it to outturn even P-47 Thunderbolt fighters in simulated combat. On December 17, 1944, the Silver Plate B-29s and their crews were organized into a specialized unit known as the 509th Composite Group, headed by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, the man who would later fly the atomic bombing mission over Hiroshima as mentioned. On December 17, 1944, the Silver Plate B-29s and their crews were organized into a specialized unit known as the 509th Composite Group, headed by Colonel Paul W. Tibbets. Over the following 6 months, the 509th trained intensively for their upcoming missions, flying long, over-water navigation missions from Batista Field in Cuba and conducting precision bombing practice over Wendover Field. The Manhattan Project produced 2 atomic bomb designs, codenamed Little Boy and Fat Man. Little Boy was a gun-type weapon fueled by uranium-235. When detonated, a small propellant charge launched one subcritical mass of uranium into another, creating a supercritical assembly and triggering a nuclear chain reaction. Fat Man, by contrast, was an implosion-style weapon which used a set of high-explosive lenses to create a spherical shockwave and compress a baseball-sized plutonium-239 core to criticality. Compared to plutonium-239, uranium-235 was extremely labor-intensive to enrich, meaning that by early 1945, only enough had been produced to fuel a single bomb. Consequently, the little boy design was not tested before being dropped over Hiroshima, while nearly all future nuclear weapons would be based on the Fat Man design. However, the implosion concept was unproven and would not be shown to work until the successful detonation of the Trinity device, the world's first nuclear explosion, on July 16, 1945. Nonetheless, the 509th continued to train for their still hypothetical missions. Due to its unusual shape and size, the Fat Man bomb behaved very differently from conventional aerial weapons. Thus, to familiarize the crews with its handling, Captain William Parsons and Charles Lauritzen of the Manhattan Project's Ordnance Division created an inert training version known as pumpkin bombs. Named after their bulbous shape and the dark yellow zinc chromate paint they were delivered in, pumpkin bombs were produced in two versions: an inert version filled with plaster and cement, and a live version filled with 2,500 kilograms of Composition B explosive. Both fillings were designed to closely approximate the weight distribution of the atomic physics package that would eventually go inside the casings. A total of 486 pumpkin bombs were produced by the end of the war, with the inert versions being delivered directly to Wendover Field. Finally, on May 4, 1945, Major Sweeney was made commander of the 393rd Bombardment Squadron. 4 weeks later, in late May and early June, he and the rest of the 509th were deployed to the island of Tinian in the northern Pacific Marianas Chain. Only 2,400 kilometers south of Tokyo, the tiny 100-square-kilometer island was an ideal launching point for U.S. Army Air Force bombing raids against the Japanese home islands, and was captured on August 1, 1944, after a week of savage fighting that claimed the lives of 300 American and 6,000 Japanese soldiers. Almost as soon as the fighting ceased, Navy Construction Battalion, or Seabees, moved in and began transforming the island into the world's largest air base. As Manhattan Project weaponeer Philip Morrison later recalled, Tinian is a miracle. Here, 6,000 miles from San Francisco, the United States Armed Forces have built the largest airport in the world. A great coral ridge was half-leveled to fill a rough plain and to build 6 runways, each an excellent 10-lane highway, each almost 2 miles long. Beside these runways stood in long rows the great silvery airplanes. They were not by the dozen, but by the hundred. From the air, this island, smaller than Manhattan, looked like a giant aircraft carrier, its deck loaded with bombers. Once on Tinian, the 509th continued its training. Accompanying units of the 20th Air Force on conventional firebombing raids, they practiced for their upcoming atomic missions by dropping high-explosive pumpkin bombs. Between the 20th of July and 8th of August 1945, the 509th dropped a total of 43 pumpkin bombs on 12 Japanese cities, including Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. Then, on July the 26th, 1945, the moment they had been waiting for finally arrived. On that day, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, US President Harry Truman, and Chinese Chairman Chiang Kai-shek issued the Potsdam Declaration, which called for the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all the Japanese armed forces and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternate for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The following day, leaflets were dropped over 11 Japanese cities warning of their imminent destruction. Yet despite these apocalyptic ultimatums, the Japanese roundly ignored the Potsdam Declaration. Meanwhile, some 3 million Allied troops were massing in the Pacific in preparation for Operation Downfall, the planned amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands. With the Japanese population expected to fight frantically to the death, the predicted casualties were horrific, as high as 800,000 Allied servicemen and 10 million Japanese soldiers and civilians. Thus, in a bid to end the war quickly and save Allied lives, on August 3rd, President Truman issued the order to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. The Little Boy uranium bomb, which had been delivered to Tinian by the USS Indianapolis on the same day as the Potsdam Declaration, was quickly readied for use, and in the early morning hours of August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Tibbets, took off for Hiroshima. She was accompanied by 2 other superfortresses, Necessary Evil, piloted by Captain George W. Marquard, and the Great Artiste, piloted by Major Sweeney. These aircraft carried scientific instruments and cameras to record the blast and measure its effect on the city. 3 other aircraft flew ahead to observe the weather over Hiroshima and the 2 secondary targets, Kokura and Nagasaki. The crews flew a textbook mission, encountering no enemy opposition, dropping the bomb right on target, and returning to Tinian 12 hours later. Waiting on the tarmac was General Carl Spaatz, commander of the Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, who personally awarded Colonel Tibbets the Distinguished Service Order. Yet despite unleashing more death and destruction more quickly than any military attack in history, Enola Gay's mission seemed to have little effect on the Japanese government, who continued their policy of silence. This was only partly due to fanaticism. The utter devastation inflicted on Hiroshima interrupted communications coming out of the city, likely making it difficult for the government to fully grasp the enormity of what had happened. Whatever the case, with no response to the Potsdam Declaration in sight, President Truman approved the use of the second atomic bomb. On August the 8th, the 509th received Operation Order No. 39, assigning command of the second atomic bombing, codenamed Special Mission No. 16, to Charles Sweeney and his crew. Sweeney would fly the B-29 Boxcar, named after its regular pilot, Captain Frederick C. Bok, and would be accompanied by the Great Artiste, flown by Bok, and Big Stink, flown by Major James I. Hopkins, Jr. Sweeney's crew on Boxcar comprised 12 men, co-pilots Captain Charles D. Albury and Lieutenant Frederick J. Olivey, navigator Captain James F. Van Pelt, Jr., bombardier Captain Kermit Behan, radio operator Staff Sergeant Abe M. Spitzer, Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant John D. Carruck, Radar Operator Staff Sergeant Edward K. Buckley, Central Fire Control Gunner Staff Sergeant Albert T. DeHart, and Mechanic and Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant Raymond G. Gallagher. Though as the aircraft had been stripped of nearly all its defensive armament, the latter two crews served mainly as observers. Also aboard were Lieutenant Commander Frederick L. Ashworth and Lieutenant Philip M. Barnes, the weaponeers in charge of arming the Fat Man bomb, and Lieutenant Jacob Beeser, a radar countermeasures expert and the only man to fly both atomic missions aboard the attacking aircraft. Meanwhile, the Great Artiste and Big Stink carried scientific and recording equipment, as well as Manhattan Project scientist Dr. Robert Serber, New York Times reporter William L. Lawrence, Group Captain G. Leonard Cheshire, member of the British military mission to the United States, and Dr. William G. Penney, professor of applied mathematics, London University, and the man who would later head the development of the British atomic bomb. The flight path called for Boxcar, the Great Artiste, and Big Stink to rendezvous over the island of Iwo Jima, then proceed towards the target at an altitude of 31,000 feet. Ships, submarines, and a fourth B-29 full house were on standby along the flight path in case any of the aircraft were forced to ditch, while another two B-29s, Enola Gay and Lagan Dragon, flew on ahead to scout the weather over the targets. The primary target for the mission was Kokura, with Nagasaki as the secondary. Kokura was a major weapons manufacturing center and home of the Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Work, while Nagasaki was one of the largest shipbuilding and repair centers in Japan. But while most target cities had been spared conventional bombing so that the effects of the atomic bomb could be more easily gauged, Nagasaki had been firebombed just a few weeks prior, making it a less desirable target. Nagata was briefly considered as a possible third target, but was too far away from Kokura and Nagasaki to be practical. Though the crews would face many risks, including weather, enemy guns, and aircraft, and the possibility of the bomb malfunctioning or detonating midair, Sweeney later admitted that his greatest fear was screwing up, especially after Tibbetts' textbook mission. "I'd rather face the Japanese than Tibbetts in shame if I made a stupid mistake." But fortune, it seemed, was not on Sweeney's side, for the whole mission seemed jinxed from the start. The first hiccup occurred right before takeoff when a mechanic informed Sweeney that due to a failed fuel pump, it would be impossible to use the 600 gallons of reserve fuel in the bomb bay tank. As the pump would take hours to fix, Sweeney decided to proceed without it. Then, while taxiing onto the runway, Major Hopkins, Big Stink's pilot, forced Dr. Robert Serber to disembark because he had forgotten his parachute. As Serber was the only man who knew how to operate Big Stink's high-speed camera, Hopkins was forced to break radio silence to receive instructions on its use. From here, Boxcar lifted off from Tinian at 3:49 a.m. local time and flew northeast toward the rendezvous point. En route, Lieutenant Commander Ashworth and Lieutenant Barnes armed the bomb, replacing the green safety plugs with red arming plugs. Soon after, the next hiccup in the mission arrived as bad weather over Iwo Jima forced Sweeney to divert to Yakushima in the Ryukyu Islands. But when he finally arrived, only Bok in the Great Artiste was there to meet him. Hopkins, having gotten lost in thick cloud cover, was circling a point several hundred kilometers south. Due to the inoperative reserve fuel tank, Sweeney had been instructed to linger no longer than 15 minutes at the rendezvous point, but he waited for 45, scanning the horizon for any sign of Big Stink. Meanwhile, Hopkins decided to break radio silence, calling in to the ether, "Chuck, where the hell are you?" But it was too late. Sweeney decided he had waited long enough, turned northeast, and headed towards Kokura. Some hours later, the mission faced another hair-raising brush with disaster. The electronic diagnostic box connected to the bomb featured a red light. So long as the light blinked at a steady rhythm, all was well. Suddenly, however, the light began blinking irregularly, causing Ashworth and Barnes to leap into action. If the arming circuits had somehow been activated, the bomb could detonate in the bomb bay, vaporizing Boxcar and the Great Artiste. But after several minutes of frantic searching, the weaponeers finally located the fault. A pair of rotary switches in the diagnostic box had somehow been wired backwards. When the wires were reversed, the light returned to its regular rhythm. Disaster had been averted. For now, at least. 6 hours after takeoff, the two bombers finally arrived over Kokura. Though the weather aircraft had reported only 3/10 cloud cover, by the time the strike force arrived, the city was completely obscured, with smoke from a firebombing raid on nearby Yahata making visibility even worse. Under strict orders to make the bombing run visually, Sweeney made 3 long passes over the city, but Captain Behan was unable to spot the target through his Norden bomb sight. Meanwhile, in the tailgun position, Staff Sergeant Gallagher reported seeing bursts of anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighter aircraft through the haze. Finally, after circling Kokura for 50 minutes, Sweeney accepted defeat and diverted for the secondary target, Nagasaki. But misfortune continued to plague the mission, for the weather conditions over Nagasaki were little better than Kokura, the city being obscured under 9/10 cloud cover. Running low on fuel, Sweeney considered breaking his orders and dropping the bomb by radar. The alternatives, as he later recalled, were less than desirable. We would not have landed with the bomb on board, we would have released it somehow or other. We would have dived the airplane into the target. I told that to my crew. I said, "You were with me the other day on Hiroshima, and now Colonel Tibbets did a great job." I was trying to get their adrenaline going. You know, the pep talk between the halves or something. I said, "Now we're going to deliver this bomb. We're not going to bring it back. If we have to, we're going to dive the airplane into the target." I don't think it would have gone off if we did, but they didn't know that. Well, I would have never done that. I would have taken them out to our ship and bailed them out and maybe take our bombardier back with me and dive into the target. But when you're young like that, you feel that, at least I felt, you're only paying your dues if you have to. But then, as co-pilot Lieutenant Olivi later recalled, the mission's luck finally changed. We started an approach, but Barron couldn't see the target area. Van Pelt, the navigator, was checking by radar to see if he has the right city, and it looked like we would be dropping the bomb automatically by radar. At the last few seconds of the bomb run, Behan yelled into his mic, "I've got a hole! I can see it! I can see the target!" Apparently, he'd spotted an opening in the clouds only 20 seconds before releasing the bomb. Using the Mitsubishi Sports Stadium as an aiming point, Behan released the bomb at 11:01 a.m. local time. Meanwhile, the Great Artiste dropped 3 instrument packages on parachutes. Immediately, Sweeney and Bach pulled their aircraft into sharp 60-degree left banks. Then, 50 seconds after release, a blinding flash filled the air. As reporter William Lawrence, watching from the Great Artiste, later recounted, "We removed our glasses after the first flash, but the light still lingered on, a bluish-green light that illuminated the entire sky all around. A tremendous blast wave struck our ship and made it tremble from nose to tail. This was followed by 4 more blasts in rapid succession, each resounding like the boom of a cannon fire hitting our plane from all directions. We watched a giant pillar of purple fire, 10,000 feet high, shoot upward like a meteor coming from the Earth instead of from outer space. It was no longer smoke or dust or even a cloud of fire. It was a living thing, a new species of being born right before our incredulous eyes. Even as we watched, a giant mushroom came shooting out of the top to 45,000 feet, a mushroom top that was even more alive than the pillar, seething and boiling in a white fury of creamy foam. 1,000 geysers rolled into one. It kept struggling in an elemental fury like a creature in the act of breaking the bonds that held it down. When we at last saw it, it had changed its shape into a flower-like form, its giant petals curving downward, creamy white outside, rose-colored inside. The boiling pillar had become a giant mountain of jumbled rainbows, but awe suddenly turned to terror as the fruits of the airman's labor began to catch up with him. As Lieutenant Olivi recalled, right after the blast, we had lunged downward and away from the radioactive cloud. We felt 3 separate shock waves, the first being the most severe. As the mushroom cloud kept on climbing towards us, bright flames, a sickly pink, were shooting out of its interior. I had a sickish feeling in the pit of my stomach that we were going to be enveloped by the cloud. We had been warned many times about the possibility possibility of radiation poisoning if we flew into it. Actually, I think the mushroom cloud missed us by about 125 yards before we pulled away from it. The briefings and all practice we had on evasive tactics now had special meaning. Their mission accomplished and dangerously low on fuel, the two B-29s circled the city once before turning for home. Meanwhile, Major Hopkins in full house spotted the flash and mushroom cloud from 160 kilometers away and flew over in the hopes of photographing the damage. Unfortunately, by the time he arrived, the city was completely obscured by clouds and smoke. Without enough fuel to reach Tinian, Sweeney instead headed for the island of Okinawa, reducing his engine speed and leaning his mixture in order to save fuel. At long last, he spotted the runways of Yontan Field and radioed that he was coming in for an emergency landing. When the airfield did not respond, he ordered the crew to fire off every emergency flare on board. Lieutenant Olivy described what happened next. Someone must have gotten the message because when we lined up on approach, we could see emergency equipment racing out to the runway. We had only enough gas for one pass, so if we didn't make it, we were going to end up in the ocean. Sweeney came in high and fast. Too fast. Normal landing speed for the B-29 was about 130 miles per hour. We used up half the strip before we touched down at about 150 miles an hour, a dangerous speed with nearly empty gas tanks. As we touched down, the plane began to swerve to the left and we nearly plowed into a line of B-24s parked along the active runway. Sweeney finally brought the plane under control, and as we taxied off the runway, the number 2 engine quit. Ambulance, staff cars, jeeps, and fire engines quickly surrounded us, and a bunch of very jittery people debarked, very glad to be safe on the ground. In fact, the landing was even more dramatic than Olivy describes, for Sweeney was forced to make a sharp 90-degree swerve at the end of the runway to avoid going off a cliff into the sea. As radar countermeasures expert Lieutenant Besser recalled, the centrifugal force resulting from the turn was almost enough to put us through the side of the airplane. You can't come any closer to disaster than we had and live to tell about it. It was 10:30 p.m. when Boxcar finally came to a stop. Immediately upon landing, Sweeney attempted to radio headquarters and deliver his report, but was denied permission without the approval of a general. Thankfully, one just happened to be available, none other than legendary General James Doolittle, who had recently arrived to take command of air operations on Okinawa. As Doolittle listened, Sweeney delivered his mission report, shamefully admitting that he had probably screwed up and missed his target. But Doolittle was more optimistic, reassuring Sweeney that, "I'm sure General Spatz will be much happier that the bomb went off in a river valley rather than over the city with the resulting much lower number of casualties." Sweeney and his crew remained just long enough for their aircraft to be fueled and repaired before setting off for Tinian, arriving around midnight. As Lieutenant Besser later recalled, the reception was very different than after the Hiroshima mission. There were no crowds to greet these crews, no medal pinning ceremony, only those who would be concerned with our interrogation were there. As Sweeney had feared, Colonel Tibbets called the mission a fiasco and considered whether to reprimand Sweeney for his conduct. General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff for the Strategic Air Forces, confronted Sweeney asking, "You f***ed up, didn't you, Chuck?" but ultimately decided that an investigation into Sweeney's conduct of the mission would serve no useful purpose. However, in the end, Sweeney received the Distinguished Service Cross, while every member of his crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross for their part in the historic mission. It was nearly a week before the clouds and smoke over Nagasaki cleared and the effects of Sweeney's mission could be assessed. The bomb had detonated 2.4 kilometers northeast of the original target near the Mitsubishi shipyards up the valley of the Urakami River. This was a heavily industrialized area and also the center of Catholicism in Japan. Indeed, Urakami Cathedral lay less than a kilometer from ground zero, and all those praying there that morning were killed instantly. But while the Fat Man bomb was nearly 1.5 times more powerful than Little Boy, the overall damage and death toll at Nagasaki was relatively limited compared to Hiroshima, with the hilly terrain helping to contain the blasts and subsequent fires. In the end, only 44% of the city was destroyed compared to 60% of Hiroshima, while 100,000 residents were killed or wounded compared to 129,000. As for the bomb's effect on the Japanese government, this was not immediately apparent. With the Japanese maintaining their silence, President Truman thus authorized the use of a third bomb, though this could not be made ready for several months. In the meantime, conventional bombing raids continued, with the 509th dropping its last 6 pumpkin bombs on Nagoya and Kuroma on August the 14th. Then, the next morning, the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The Emperor appeared on the radio and announced Japan's unconditional surrender. 18 days later, in a ceremony aboard the battleship USS Missouri, delegates of the Japanese government signed the formal instruments of surrender, finally bringing the deadliest conflict in modern history to an end. While the atomic bombing of Nagasaki is often credited with convincing the Japanese to surrender, the event which more likely forced their hand was the Soviet Union's invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, which began the same day. Now facing a war on two fronts and realizing the communist Soviets were unlikely to allow them to keep their emperor, the Japanese War Cabinet opted to surrender to the Western allies, whom they hoped would offer more reasonable terms. In the end, what the bombs did do was give the emperor a way to save face with his people in such a surrender. From here, Sweeney, like so many others, remained steadfast in his belief that the use of the atomic bombs was entirely justified, stating in a 1995 interview, "I saw these beautiful young men who were being slaughtered. There's no question in my mind that President Truman made the right decision. The true vessel of remorse and guilt belonged to the Japanese nation, which could and should call to account the warlords who so willingly offered up their own people to achieve their visions of greatness." As for what happened after dropping the bomb, in November 1945, Sweeney returned to the United States and was posted to Roswell Air Force Base in New Mexico, where he trained air crews for Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear weapons tests conducted at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. Just a few weeks before the tests, he was honorably discharged from the active service with the rank of lieutenant colonel. In the 1950s, he joined the Massachusetts Air National Guard and coordinated civil defense efforts in Boston, eventually rising to the rank of major general. Following his retirement from the military in 1976, he ran a leather brokerage business. Charles William Sweeney died in Boston on July 16, 2004, at the age of 84. Despite his belief that the atomic bombings of Japan were justified, he hoped that such an action would never again become necessary, stating, "It is my fervent hope that there will never be another atomic mission. In 1945, we dropped bombs that were primitive in comparison to nuclear weapons today. As the man who commanded the last atomic mission, I pray that I retain that singular distinction."